Lecture 34, Within Family Differences. In the last lecture, we saw that the non-shared environment plays a major role in shaping the individual's personality and attitudes. In fact, when it comes to personality and attitudes, variability within families is almost as great as variability between families, which raises the question, why are children from the same family so different from each other? Part of the answer, of course, is that each individual in the family has a somewhat different genetic heritage. Unless you're identical twins or triplets or whatever, siblings from the same parents only have about 50% of their genes in common. But as we also saw, the environment extends beyond the family to include the child's peer groups, teachers, ministers, and other people, adults and children, who have an impact on the child's growing personality. But it turns out that even if you confine your analysis to what's going on within the family, you don't step outside the door of the house. The social environment for each child in the family is different. That there are differences between families is obvious enough. That the environment of the child extends beyond the home is also obvious. What's not been so obvious until recently is the magnitude of within-family environmental differences. Credit for drawing our attention to these differences goes largely to a developmental psychologist, Judith Rich Harris, who's written a number of books on this subject. Her work forms the basis of this lecture. In her research, Harris has identified a number of factors that operate within a family, which, taken together with genetic differences and differences in the extrafamilial environment, tend to make variability within a family about as great as variability between families. They tend to make children from the same family so different from one another. Harris calls the first of these factors child-driven effects. Each child brings certain physical and behavioral characteristics into the family, which in turn affect how he or she is treated by parents, siblings, and others. Some of these child-driven effects reflect the family's response to the physical appearance of the child. These represent what I consider to be the evocation mode of the person-by-situation interaction. The clearest example, which we've already discussed in the lectures on personality and social interaction, is how the child's biological sex, whether he or she is male or female, affects gender role socialization. Here, the mere physical appearance of the child structures the environment by evoking differential treatment from other people according to cultural prescriptions for the proper raising of boys and girls. Other examples come to mind, which also have to do with the child's physical appearance, broadly construed. It seems to make a difference, even in the family, whether the child is conventionally cute or pretty versus being ordinary in appearance, or perhaps has some kind of blemish or disfigurement. That's not to say that parents and older siblings necessarily treat homely children worse than they treat cute children, only that they may treat them differently. It may also make a difference whether the child physically resembles his or her parents or others in the immediate family. Differences are also likely to arise depending on whether the child is healthy or ill. Again, I'm not suggesting that ill children are ignored or mistreated in any way, much less consigned to an ice floe. Children who are chronically ill may be protected by their parents and older brothers and sisters in a way that more robust children are not. The point is that these differences in treatment occur within the family and are determined by certain features of the child. Other child-driven reactive effects are instigated by the behavior of the child, not just his or her physical appearance. Reactions to the child's physical appearance reflect the evocation mode of the person-situation interaction. Reactive effects related to the behavior of the child reflect the manipulation mode, because here it's something about the child's behavior that's changing the environment in which the child is raised. The manipulation doesn't have to be deliberate. Nevertheless, there is something that the child does, however unwittingly or involuntarily, to alter the environment of the family in which he or she is being raised. Perhaps the clearest reactive effects of the child's behavior have to do with individual differences in temperament, by which we mean the child's speed and strength of emotional arousal. Temperament is usually thought of as the product of genetic endowment and physiology, which combine to give the child a generally quiet or fussy disposition. Then, the child's temperament-related behaviors, whether the child really is quiet or fussy, will interact with the parents, eliciting behavior from the parents that alters the environment in which the child is raised. In a positive feedback loop, for example, a child with a pleasant, quiet temperament might elicit positive treatment from his or her parents, while one with a fussy, unpleasant temperament might elicit negative treatment. Of course, the parent's behavioral response to the child will elicit subsequent behavior from the child, him or herself. In this way, a kind of vicious cycle can develop that strengthens the child's initial behavioral tendencies, making a quiet child even quieter and a fussy child even fussier. There can also occur a kind of negative feedback loop in which, for example, a child with a quiet temperament might elicit lower limit control behaviors from the parents intended to increase his or her activity levels. It's as if the parents say, "Okay, we're going to let you be quiet, but we don't want you to be too quiet." Similarly, a child with a very active temperament might elicit upper limit control behaviors intended to decrease that behavior. Again, it's as if the parents say, "We don't mind if you're kind of fussy and active, but don't overdo it." Now remember from our discussion of motivation how positive and negative feedback are defined. They don't refer to pleasant or unpleasant consequences of behavior, like reward and punishment. Instead, positive feedback refers to any response that strengthens the stimulus that produced it, and negative feedback refers to any response that weakens the stimulus that produced it. When parents treat a quiet child in such a way as to get that child to be even quieter, they're delivering positive feedback because they're strengthening the tendency of the child to be quiet. But when parents of a quiet child engage in lower limit control behaviors that are intended to make the child less quiet, even just a little bit, they're delivering negative feedback. Of course, these child-driven effects may extend beyond the child's interactions with his or her parents and older siblings, as the child begins to venture outside the home to playgroups and school and sports programs and the like. But right now, we're concerned only with what goes on inside the house, inside the immediate family. In general, child-driven effects are somewhat unpredictable because they greatly depend on the response to the child by the people who make up the child's environment, their own personalities, beliefs, attitudes, goals, and the like. The point here is just that boys and girls, quiet and fussy children, healthy and sick children, may elicit differential treatment from their parents and siblings, and in that respect, they are being raised in different family environments, even though they all live in the same household. In addition to child-driven reactive effects, there are also relationship-driven effects, which have to do with the fit between the child and the parent in terms of things like appearance, temperament, and other aspects of personality. A plain-looking child of a beautiful mother and a handsome father may get treated very differently than a child who's born to parents who are themselves rather plain-looking. An extroverted child may elicit very different behaviors from extroverted adults than he or she would from introverted adults. Extroverted adults are, well, they're extroverted. They know what to do with a child who's extroverted, and they may not have the foggiest idea how to handle a child who is somewhat introverted, quiet, shy, and withdrawn. And the same thing goes for a child who's somewhat introverted. The match between an introverted child and an introverted adult may be much better than that between an introverted child and an extroverted adult. The introverted adult may have a better sense of what the introverted child wants, different expectations, different preferences for the child. Relationship-driven effects are related to the selection mode of the person-by-situation interaction because they involve the degree of fit between the child and other people, especially the parents and siblings who make up his or her family environment. The source of the effect doesn't come from the child alone, and it doesn't come from the parents alone either. It's really driven by the relationship between the child and the parents. But there are some within family effects that do indeed begin with the parents. These are known as parent-driven effects. Parents don't just react to their children's appearance or behavior or temperament or personality. To some extent, parental behavior is independent of the physical, mental, and behavioral characteristics of the child. Sad as it may be, some parents will reject a child who's the product of an unplanned pregnancy. This doesn't always happen, of course. Unplanned pregnancies can be joyful surprises for parents. But to think that they're all blessed events is asking too much. Sometimes an unplanned child is a burden on the parents, and, for that matter, other family members, making it more difficult for them to cope, especially in hard economic times. Sometimes the appearance of a child on the scene conflicts with the parents' other plans, or makes life difficult for them in some way. This is why, psychologically, it's so important that every child be actively wanted by his parents. It's important to note that this kind of behavior, when it occurs, and we can hope it occurs relatively rarely, is independent of anything the child is or the child does, and it's got nothing to do with the relationship between the parent and the child, except perhaps that the child doesn't fit in with the parent's plans. Another example of parent-driven effects has to do with how parents treat identical twins. Identical twins, of course, resemble each other very closely. Sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. And the question is, what do parents do when they have identical twins or triplets? Some parents try to treat identical twins very similarly with respect to dress, activities, and the like. They'll go out of their way to make sure that both children attend the same schools and wear the same kinds of clothes and all of that. Other parents of identical twins will go out of their way to treat them very differently. They'll dress them differently. They'll even send them to different schools, or at least make sure that they have different teachers, since they're both in the same grade. To the extent that identical twins are deliberately treated differently by their parents, of course, they're raised in different environments, despite having identical genetic endowments, and despite the fact that they're living in the same physical household. They may actually have very little by way of shared environment, and a great deal by way of non-shared environment. Finally, parents who have more than one child sometimes experience contrast effects on their perceptions of their offspring. For example, if the first child has been difficult to raise, the second may be perceived as easier to raise. If so, some of this may have to do with the fact that the parents of a second child are just more experienced parents. They're smarter about parenting. But we're not talking about how parents perceive themselves as parents. We're talking about how the parents perceive the child and how those perceptions affect their behavior towards the child. On the other hand, if the first child was very easy to raise, the second may be perceived as more difficult to raise, even if there are no objective differences in the two children's behavior. Whatever happens, these different perceptions on the part of the parents will naturally translate into different parenting behaviors, which will exaggerate the differences in home environments between the children. These parent-driven effects are, I think, related to the cognitive transformation mode of the person-by-situation interaction, because they arise in the first place from how the parent perceives the child. If the parent perceives the unplanned child as a burden, that will have behavioral consequences that are different than if the parent perceives the unplanned child as a blessing. Finally, Harris points out that there can be big differences in family context effects on the children in the same family. Family context effects relate to what the sociologists would call the children's microenvironments within a family. I'll give you a personal example. In my family, there was a father, a mother, and 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. But my brother's family environment was different. It consisted of his parents, who of course were also my parents, but it also included my sister and me. He had an older sister, and so did I. But he had a younger brother, and I had an older brother. Similarly, my sister's family environment consisted of our parents and my brother and me. She had 2 younger brothers to contend with. There were different people in each child's environment. To be completely blunt about it, I grew up in an environment that included a very popular cheerleader and a varsity basketball player. My sister and my brother did not. And it's the same for every child in every family. Understanding the microenvironment for each family member reveals just how big the difference in family environment can be for each child within the family. Perhaps the most controversial family context effects involve birth order. That is, the possibility that there are systematic differences in personality between firstborn and latter-born siblings in a family. Remember that setting aside identical twins and identical triplets, there are no systematic genetic differences between firstborn and latter-borns. All brothers and sisters share a random 50% of their genes in common. So any systematic differences between firstborns and latter-borns have to be due to their position in what's known as the family constellation, the configuration of individuals within a family that's roughly analogous to the configuration of the stars in a constellation. Until recently, most theorists believed that birth order effects didn't exist, or that at best they were weak and inconsistent. To be sure, there have been occasional studies that demonstrated personality differences between firstborns and latterborns, but there were lots of confounding variables that made the studies difficult to interpret. For example, by definition, firstborns are older than latterborns, so any systematic differences between them might be a product of age, not of family constellation. Of course, you could also test siblings within the family when they came of the same age. But that's not the only problem, and the other problems are less easy to cope with. For example, by definition, birth order is correlated with family size. You can't be a latterborn unless there are at least 2 children in the family, and you can't be the 5th born unless there are at least 5. Family size, in turn, is correlated with parents' education, occupation, and socioeconomic status. As a general rule, at least in Western countries, highly educated, wealthy, professional people tend to have fewer children than poorly educated, poorer, working-class people. There are some exceptions, of course. For example, members of the Mormon religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, are encouraged to have as many children as they can afford. So Mormons generally show a negative correlation between socioeconomic status and family size. But the fact that family size tends to be negatively correlated with socioeconomic status means that in most populations, subjects who are firstborns will be from wealthier families, on average, than subjects who are latterborns. It takes a little while to get your head around this, but give it a try. If there were fewer latterborns in wealthier families, then the average latterborn is going to be poorer than the average earlyborn. Anyway, for this reason, differences between earlyborns and latterborns may be an artifact of differences in socioeconomic status. None of these problems are intractable, however, provided that your sample sizes are large enough. Frank Soloway, a historian of science who has dabbled in evolutionary psychology, has argued that, in Darwinian terms, siblings compete with each other for their place in the family environment, just like species and organisms compete for their environmental niches in nature. Think about the situation described by Jane Austen in her novel Pride and Prejudice, with the 5 Bennet sisters all competing for various beaus, and, for that matter, all the men in that novel competing with each other for the 5 sisters and their friends. Sulloway argues that firstborns, almost by definition, get first choice of environmental niche in the family. They want to please their parents, and so they are more conscientious and conservative. By contrast, Sulloway argues, latter-borns have to find other ways of distinguishing themselves, making them more egalitarian and anti-authoritarian. From Sulloway's point of view, latter-borns are born to rebel, which, not coincidentally, is the title of his book on birth order effects. As an example of the sort of competition process that Sulloway has in mind, consider the practice of primogeniture, quite common among the titled lords and landed gentry in England and elsewhere in Europe well into the 20th century. In this practice, the firstborn son inherited the father's estate, leaving the other sons to fend for themselves. And for that reason, parents wanted to marry their daughters off to firstborn sons, so they would not have to provide so much of a dowry. If the firstborn son was disobedient, he might be disowned and have to work for a living. And if an eligible girl couldn't find a firstborn son to marry, her parents would have to provide a substantial dowry. Sulloway, trained as a historian of science, has argued that in history, those scientists who made truly revolutionary contributions to their fields tended to be latter-borns. That's one way of being born to rebel. And this led him to become interested in the wider psychological literature on birth order and personality. Now, Sulloway is not a psychologist himself, but what he did was to turn to the published literature on birth order and personality and perform a meta-analysis, a type of quantitative review that summarizes and aggregates the outcomes of many different studies. And when he did this, summarizing the results of 196 different comparisons, he found systematic birth order effects on personality. For example, when it came to measures of neuroticism, firstborns tended to score higher than latterborns. Firstborns tended to be more jealous, more anxious, more neurotic, more fearful, more likely to affiliate with others under conditions of stress. That doesn't mean that every firstborn is wildly crazy, anxious, and neurotic, and every latterborn is perfectly stable. We're talking about average differences. And, for that matter, we're talking about average differences within normal limits. It's just that firstborns tend to score higher on scales of neuroticism than latterborns do. And this is exactly what Sulloway predicted on the basis of his theory, because firstborns ought to be more nervous about their position in the family than latterborns are. They know what they're going to get and what they've got to lose. Similarly, with respect to extroversion, firstborns score higher than latterborns. Firstborns tend to be more extroverted, more assertive, more likely to exert leadership in groups. And that is, of course, exactly what they do in families, take a leadership position among the siblings. This is true whether you're a firstborn boy or a firstborn girl. The situation reverses with respect to agreeableness, where latterborns tend to score higher than firstborns. Latterborns tend to be more easygoing, more cooperative, and more popular with others. There's less at stake for them, according to Sulloway's evolutionary argument. With respect to conscientiousness, we're back to firstborns scoring higher than latterborns. Firstborns tend to be more responsible, more achievement-oriented, more organized, and more planful. And again, this is exactly what Sulloway would predict on the basis of his evolutionary argument. Firstborns are going to be more conscientious, latterborns are going to be more carefree. And finally, of course, with respect to openness to experience, latterborns tend to score higher than firstborns. Firstborns are more conforming, more traditional, more closely identified with their parents' attitudes, beliefs, values, and goals. Latterborns do seem to be more open to things, more liberal, as Sulloway would put it,
born to rebel. But remember, ordinal position within a family is no more decisive for personality than genes are. We're talking about trends here, trends that might reveal some interesting family dynamics, their impact on the individual, and how they help create an environment that's different for each individual within the family.
These findings are provocative, but please remember that ordinal position within a family is no more decisive for personality than genes are. We're talking about trends here, trends that nevertheless reveal some interesting family dynamics, their impact on the individual, and how they help create an environment that's different for each individual within the family. Now again, I don't want to exaggerate these differences. They're there, and they're significant, but they don't apply to every case, and they don't even occur in every study. Sulloway counted the number of comparisons on each dimension that gave positive, negative, or null findings with respect to his hypothesis. Positive results were significant differences in the direction he predicted. Negative results were significant differences in the opposite direction. Null results were non-significant differences in either direction. What he discovered was that for each big 5 dimension, more studies supported his hypothesis than contradicted it. Of course, there were lots of null results. In fact, of the total of 196 comparisons, only a minority of the studies, 72 out of 196, or about 37%, actually confirmed his hypothesis. However, if you adopt the standard criterion for statistical significance, p less than 0.05, meaning that a result has a 5% probability of occurring randomly by chance, this is much more than we'd expect by chance. By chance, we'd expect only 10% of the studies to confirm his hypothesis. And even fewer studies yielded clearly negative results than you'd expect by chance. Sulloway's meta-analysis was instantly controversial, but it has to be said that it has persuasive power, and much of the power that it has comes from the fact that he made his predictions in advance based on his understanding of Darwinian theory. However, his reanalysis of all these studies did involve a lot of interpretation, and so it would be nice to see his findings confirmed in a study expressly designed to test his hypothesis. Just such a study was reported by Del Paulus and his colleagues based on samples drawn from student populations at UC Berkeley when Paulus was here on sabbatical. Paulus asked his subjects to think about themselves and their siblings and to nominate who in their family was the achiever and who was the rebel. In the first study, which is based on the California data, Paulus found that subjects were more likely to nominate the firstborn child in their family as the achiever and a latter-born child in the family as the rebel, more likely than we would expect by chance. For example, if there were just 2 children in a family, we'd expect 50%, 1 out of 2, firstborns to be nominated as achievers, and 50% of latter-borns, the remaining 1 out of 2, to be nominated as rebels, just by chance. But on the contrary, in the California sample, Paulus found 65% of achiever nominees were firstborns, and 61% of rebel nominees were latter-borns. If there were 3 children in a family, we'd expect 1/3 of the firstborns to be nominated as achievers, and 2/3 of latter-borns, and the remaining 2 out of 3 children to be nominated as rebels, just by chance. But in the California sample, 37% of the achiever nominees were firstborns, which is more than you'd expect by chance, and 71% of the rebel nominees were latter-borns, again, more than you'd expect by chance. The same pattern occurred for families of 4 children and for families of more than 4 children. These findings, originally obtained in the California sample, were subsequently replicated by Paulus after he returned home and collected the same sort of data from a sample of Canadian college students. Again, within each SIBSHIP size, 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, and 5 or more children, more firstborns were nominated as the achiever in the family, and more latterborns were nominated as the rebel in the family than you'd expect by chance. In 2 other studies, Paulus and his colleagues found other respects in which firstborns differed from latterborns. For example, there were more firstborns nominated as the scholastic achiever in the family, and more latterborns nominated as the liberal in the family than would be expected by chance. Perhaps the most controversial claim about birth order effects is that firstborns are more intelligent in terms of scores on standard IQ tests than latterborns are. It was this hypothesis that was specifically rejected by many of the earlier studies, which identified those potential confounds that we talked about. However, a provocative study by Zients and Marcus, based on data originally collected by Belmont and Marola, has revealed an interesting, if small, effect of birth order on general intelligence that is very interesting theoretically. This study involved an analysis of data collected in the Netherlands as part of a study of the effects of the Dutch famine of 1944, which was a byproduct of World War II. As part of routine testing for the military draft, the Dutch government administered a nonverbal IQ test, actually Raven's progressive matrices, to every Dutch male who reached age 19 in the years 1963 to 1966. That is, every Dutch male of draft age who was a very young child during the Dutch famine. This is a huge data set, almost 400,000 individuals. Then they looked at mean IQ as a function of family size and birth order. The study revealed a striking interaction effect of birth order with family size on IQ. First, average IQ declined with family size. Those are individuals from families with 2 children up at the top, and individuals with families with 9 children down at the bottom. Second, within each family size, from 2 to 9 children, average IQ declined with birth order. On average, those who were the eldest child in their family had higher IQ scores than those who were the last child in the family. Third, the last-born child showed a greater decline in IQ than any other birth rank. Otherwise, the rate of decline in IQ steadily diminished with later birth ranks. And notice that individuals from families with 8 or 9 children, there's actually a slight uptick in the average IQ of the next to last born, plus that larger drop-off for the last one. And then, finally, those who are the only children in their family had a lower average IQ than the firstborns of a 2-child family, and, for that matter, the firstborns of 3- and 4-child families as well. Now, before we go on, I want you to understand clearly that the effects we've just described are very small. Look at the y-axis. The difference between the topmost point and the bottommost point on this graph is only about 4 points, with IQs centered on 100. The difference between the top and bottom means amounts to only about 10 IQ points if you do the translation. The differences achieve statistical significance only by virtue of the huge sample size involved, and even an IQ difference of 10 points is of very little practical significance. Also, of course, this figure plots only averages, meaning that there were plenty of exceptions to these trends. It wasn't the case that every firstborn scored higher than every laterborn, or that every child from a 2-child family scored higher than every child from a 5-child family. So we're talking about small differences here in absolute terms, small differences in practical terms, but the pattern we observe is of considerable theoretical significance. Big theories can be built on even small effects, provided that the differences are reliable, as these are. That's true in physics, where the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, is the size of a small city, and is built to produce in the laboratory an effect that was observed only in about the first 1/1000th of a second after the Big Bang. It's true in physics that big theories can be built on small effects, and it's true in psychology as well. In order to explain the joint effects of family size and birth order observed in the Belmont-Marola study, Zients and Marcus proposed what they called a confluence model of intellectual development. This model is intended to trace the mutual intellectual influences among children and their parents as they develop. The first major feature of the model is what's known as the dilution effect. According to the model, a newborn child effectively diminishes the intellectual resources available within a family. Newborns literally don't know very much, and their lack of knowledge, in a sense, drags the whole family down. If you've got two parents with average IQs of 100, and a newborn enters into the family, give the newborn a default IQ of 0. The average IQ in the family has been effectively reduced from 100 points to 67 points. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's the idea of the dilution effect. But that's not the end of it, because there's also a growth effect. Each child contributes more intellectual resources to the family as he or she grows up, and over time, this growth in the intelligence of the child brings the family average back up. But if more siblings come into the family, each new child is born into a progressively diminished environment. This is an extension of the dilution effect. Again, to extend the example, if a second child is born into the family when the first child has obtained 50 points of IQ, and the second child starts out at 0 like the first child did, then the average intellectual level of the family at this point is now 62 points, when it was 67 points at the time of the birth of the first child, and so on. But at the same time, each child in the family is growing up, and the intellectual growth of early born siblings progressively enhances the intellectual environment for the whole family, and to some extent counteracts the dilution effect created by the latter borns. The actual effects of dilution and growth depend on the spacing of the siblings. If the siblings are spaced closely together, the dilution effect is increased. This is because the second-born comes into a family where the first-born has not yet had an opportunity to contribute very much to its intellectual environment. If siblings are spaced farther apart, the dilution effect is weakened because the early-born has had an opportunity to develop, and thus contribute more intellectual resources to the environment. In large families, some early-borns are much older than some later-borns. Therefore, the dilution effect is weakened for these later-born children. But dilution and growth are not the only things that are going on. Zients and Marcus argue that there's also a teaching effect. Early-borns profit from the presence of later-borns because they get intellectual stimulation from teaching their younger siblings. But that creates a last child handicap. The last-born child gets the benefit of being taught by all those older siblings. But the last-born child, him or herself, doesn't get the benefit of the teaching effect simply because there are no younger siblings for him or her to teach. Therefore, the last-born child in a family is at a special disadvantage. It doesn't get the teaching effect. And for the same reason, an only child also doesn't get the benefit of the teaching effect, simply because there aren't any other children besides him or herself. This puts only children at a disadvantage compared to the firstborns of even small families, because at least the firstborns of small families get the teaching effect. In a sense, the only child is both the firstborn and the lastborn. The confluence model makes the interesting prediction that twins and triplets should be even more disadvantaged than only children because their birth produces a big dilution effect. This is in fact the case, and there are some other implications of the theory. At first glance, it would seem that children from single-parent households would be at a special disadvantage, because there's a stronger dilution effect with only one parent in a household. If a newborn comes into a single-parent household, the newborn brings down the average intellectual resources very profoundly. But, of course, single-parent households aren't always really single-parent households. There may be a boyfriend or girlfriend around the parent, or there are grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins, nephews and nieces. Children from extended families, then, may be of special advantage because there are lots of adults around to counteract the dilution effect. The confluence model tells only part of the story of intellectual development, of course. There are lots of other things going on, both genetic and environmental. But the major assumptions of the confluence model illustrate the basic points that I have tried to make throughout these lectures on personality, social interaction, and psychological development. First, the individual is a part of his or her own environment. In the confluence model, the child isn't just acted on by other people in the environment. The child also makes a difference to its own environment. This environment itself is dynamically changing as different individuals enter and leave it, and the individuals in the environment are constantly influenced by these environmental changes. At the same time, each individual reciprocally influences the environment by virtue of his or her own changes, regardless of whether those changes have to do with genetics or experience. In the lectures on personality and social interaction, I made the point that the person is part of his or her own environment, shaping the environment through evocation, selection, behavioral manipulation, and cognitive transformation. The confluence model makes clear that the person is an agent of his or her own development, influencing the environment that, in turn, has an impact on the growth of the individual, him or herself. The confluence model was specifically formulated to account for birth order and family size effects on IQ. But you can easily imagine how something like the confluence model could be extended to other aspects of personality and attitudes as well. Each is largely a product of the non-shared environment. The non-shared environment is such a powerful force in personality development because everybody creates a unique environment for him or herself, and interaction with other people through the various modes of the person-by-situation interaction: evocation, selection, behavioral manipulation, and cognitive transformation. The uniqueness of the individual's environment is the sum total of many different effects acting alone and in combination. And the uniqueness of the environment, as it is shaped by the individual him or herself, in turn contributes to the uniqueness of the individual. So there is a kind of paradox in development, which is that universal processes of development that are, well, they're universal. Everybody is affected by them. But these widely shared processes come together in such a way as to produce a unique individual, an individual who is unique in terms of personality, abilities, and attitudes. In the development of personality, abilities like intelligence, and attitudes, we see the full scope of the interactions in which the individual is involved. Interactions between nature and nurture, and interactions between the person and the environment. Much the same way as the individual is a part of his or her own environment, in a very real sense, the child acts as his or her own socialization agent, shaping him or herself and shaping the environment, as the environment in turn shapes him or her. We will see more of this in the next lecture on the development of gender dimorphism in identity, role, and sexual orientation. And now I have to confess to just a little mischief. In the standard academic year, I usually teach the introductory psychology course in the fall. And the way the schedule works, students get the lecture you've just heard right before they head home for Thanksgiving recess. I always imagine that as they look around the Thanksgiving table, they're reminded first that variability within a family is almost as great as variability between families. That the family context is different for each of the siblings in a family by virtue of child-driven effects, relationship-driven, parent-driven, and family context effects. I imagine them wondering about the teaching effect, the last child handicap, the only child handicap, the effect of being part of an extended family. The point of this is not to get people to wonder whether, in fact, mom always liked you best, The point is that the family environment is different for each individual within a family. That's true for each of the children, and it's true for the parents as well. The family is not a single, unitary, monolithic force in development that acts on the individual. Viewed psychologically, every child in a family is born to different parents, raised in a different family, lives in a different neighborhood, attends a different school, and worships in a different church. The unique environment of the individual within the family and outside it, an environment that is, to some extent, of the individual's own making, renders each individual the unique person that he or she really is.